On the 12th of February in the year 1554, the Tower of London stood heavy against the sky, its stones cold with the memory of countless deaths. Upon the green inside its walls a scaffold waited, stark and unforgiving, the wood damp with morning frost. A girl was led toward it, slender, pale, her steps hesitant yet filled with a dignity that defied her age. She was 17, her arms clasping a small Bible as though its weight alone could steady her trembling. The crowd watched in silence. No cheer, no cry, only the sound of her shoes upon the boards as Lady Jane Grey, once proclaimed queen for 9 brief days, approached the end of her life. The chill of that morning seemed to gather around her, wrapping her in a shroud before the blade ever fell. Her face lifted toward the light, calm yet unbearably fragile, a reminder that she was still only a child forced to carry the burden of crowns and betrayal. When the blindfold covered her eyes, the world vanished. Darkness pressed in, and her composure wavered. Her hands moved across the air, searching, failing to find the block that would claim her neck. A murmur rippled through the crowd as she faltered, whispering words that broke the silence. Words of fear, words that revealed the truth stripped bare. She was not a usurper, not a queen, but a girl terrified and lost, stumbling in the dark. At last the executioner took her hand and guided her to the block. She lowered herself, placed her head upon the wood, and waited. In that moment the weight of history bore down, for the axe would not simply end a life, it would silence a mind of brilliance and faith. This story is not of glory, but of sacrifice. Follow it to the end, for within the death of Lady Jane Grey lies the haunting truth of how crowns demand blood. Subscribe now, so you will not turn away from the darkest echoes hidden behind thrones. Lady Jane Grey was born in October 1537, the eldest daughter of Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, and Lady Frances Brandon. Through her mother's blood, she carried the direct line of the Tudors, a link that tied her fate to the crown of England, whether she wished it or not. She grew up not in obscurity, but in the bright and dangerous orbit of kings and queens, where every breath could be twisted into politics. From her earliest years, she was set apart, where other young girls were taught to sing, or to dance, or to prepare for marriage. Jane was immersed in study. She mastered Latin and Greek before most children could form clear sentences in their own tongue. She could read scripture in its original words, and she moved with ease between languages that most noblemen struggled to grasp. It was said that she spoke French with the clarity of a native, and that she read Italian with pleasure, as if she had grown up on the streets of Florence. Her tutors marveled not simply at her memory, but at the sharpness of her reason. Roger Ascham, who later became tutor to Princess Elizabeth, once visited her at her family's home. He found her sitting alone with a book in her lap, while others pursued hunting and music. Ascham recalled that Jane greeted him with courtesy and then confessed that she found more joy in Plato than in play, more delight in philosophy than in frivolity. His testimony spread quickly. For here was a girl not merely educated, but possessed of a brilliance that could match any scholar in Europe. To many, she was the most intelligent woman of her dynasty. Her piety matched her learning. She rose early to pray, and the pages of her Bible became worn by her constant touch. Unlike the court glittering with jewels and riddled with scandal, Jane preferred the solitude of her chamber, the company of books, and the stillness of thought. She wrote small reflections in her notebooks, weaving together theology and philosophy with a clarity that belied her age. Her mind was drawn not toward crowns but toward God, not toward power but toward wisdom. Yet in Tudor England, such gifts were perilous. A brilliant mind in a girl was not seen as a treasure but as a tool. Her parents viewed her less as a daughter and more as a means of alliance. Henry Grey's ambitions grew as Edward VI, the sickly boy king, appeared weaker each year. Francis Brandon knew the weight of bloodlines and understood that Jane's education could cloak her in an aura of majesty. Together they shaped her not for a quiet life of learning, but for the stage of politics. Jane felt the weight of expectation even as a child. Every word she spoke was measured, every gesture noted. She understood that her lineage made her valuable. Yet she longed for nothing more than the life of study she had tasted in her books. The contrast between her own desires and the demands of her family deepened with every passing season. Those who met her sensed the paradox. Here was a girl of extraordinary mind and pure devotion, yet also a pawn trapped in a dangerous game. Her brightness drew admiration, but admiration soon twisted into pressure. In an age where women rarely held authority, her intellect became both a gift and a curse. She had the wisdom of a scholar, but the power of a prisoner, bound not by chains of iron, but by the invisible cords of her blood and her name. In the quiet moments of her youth, Jane may have believed that her faith and her learning would protect her from the storms of court. But the shadows were already gathering. A girl born into Tudor blood could never belong to herself. And her very brilliance ensured that when the moment came, she would be thrust forward into the center of a storm she never asked to face. In the summer of 1553, King Edward VI was wasting away from tuberculosis. The sickness hollowed his chest and filled his lungs with fluid until every breath sounded like a death rattle. He coughed blood into the linen sheets, his thin frame shaking with each spasm. His skin stretched so tight that his veins showed like ink beneath paper. At only 16 years old, the boy who had been crowned at 9 looked more like a shadow than a sovereign. Yet even as his body collapsed, his mind fixed upon one cause. Edward VI had been raised to see himself as guardian of the Protestant faith, and the thought that his Catholic sister Mary might inherit the throne filled him with dread. Observers at court described the young king as speaking with a fevered intensity, demanding that the true faith must be protected. His council scribes recorded his last instructions, though their pens shook at the audacity of his words. He rejected Mary, he rejected Elizabeth, and he named his cousin Lady Jane Grey as heir. To some who stood at his bedside, the moment felt like madness. Chronicler Henry Mackin noted that the king was so frail his voice could barely be heard. Yet his eyes burned with a strange fire as he pressed the succession upon his cousin. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, stood ready to reinforce the plan. He knew that Mary's victory would mean ruin for every Protestant noble who had flourished under Edward VI. He had already tied his family to Jane by marrying her to his son Guilford, and now he seized the chance to rule through her. When Jane was told of the decision, she broke down in tears. She insisted that Mary was the rightful heir, and that to claim the throne was against the law of God. Roger Ascham, who had once praised her as a scholar above all others, would later recall her devotion to truth and learning, qualities that now made her resistance even more painful. But her parents urged her forward, and Dudley pressed with arguments of duty and survival. The will of the dying king weighed heavier than her protest. On the 10th of July, she entered the Tower of London, the place where monarchs were prepared for coronation. The royal robes were laid upon her shoulders, and the crown set upon her head. Observers remembered her face pale and drawn, her lips trembling as she accepted the symbols of rule she had never sought. To those who looked on, It was a scene of sorrow rather than triumph. The city did not erupt in celebration. The people watched in silence, sensing that this proclamation was already marked for tragedy. For 9 days, Jane sat in chambers meant for a queen. She prayed at dawn and at dusk, keeping her composure while beyond the walls the world shifted against her. Mary Tudor rallied her supporters. Noble families declared their loyalty to her, and messages of defection poured into London. Inside the tower, Jane carried herself with quiet dignity. Yet she must have known that the crown placed upon her by Edward VI was already soaked in her own blood. The boy king, ravaged by disease, had reached for salvation through her, and in doing so had condemned her. The crown upon Jane Grey's head began to dissolve from the very first day. She prayed in her chamber, clinging to the words of Scripture. But beyond those walls, power was already leaking from her grasp. The streets of London did not rejoice. Whispers carried faster than proclamations. People looked toward Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, as the true heir. And each day, another noble who had sworn allegiance to Jane defected. Even her own blood turned from her. Henry Grey, her father, had been one of the loudest voices pressing her toward the throne. Yet when Mary's supporters swelled and the council tilted toward the elder sister, he abandoned his daughter with shocking speed. He bent to the new queen, pleading for his own survival. Frances Brandon, Jane's mother, did not raise her voice to defend her child. In the game of Tudor politics, the bonds of family were fragile threads, snapped the moment they threatened to drag their bearers down. For Jane, the betrayal must have cut deeper than the loss of her crown. She was not merely deserted by lords or courtiers. She was left exposed by her own parents, those who should have stood between her and the storm. In that silence, she felt the true weight of isolation. She was not only a fallen queen, she was a daughter abandoned. Sir John Bridges, lieutenant of the Tower, observed her demeanor in those days. He later testified that she carried herself with quiet grace, never lashing out, never cursing those who had betrayed her. She sat with her Bible, her voice calm as she read aloud. Yet her composure stood in tragic contrast to the chaos outside her chamber, where men trampled loyalty and kinship alike in the scramble to survive. On the 19th of July, the council declared for Mary. Bells pealed across the city, crowds cheered, and London gave itself to the new queen. The silence that had marked Jane's 9 days of reign now roared with voices in another name. Within hours, she was stripped of her crown, her robes taken, her title erased. She walked the same corridors of the Tower, not as queen, but as captive. It was not simply her fall that was terrifying. It was the ease with which it happened. Those who had once sworn upon their honor dissolved their oaths without hesitation. Faith was bent to politics. Kinship was sacrificed at the altar of power. The Renaissance, an age of art and learning, revealed here its darkest face, an age where beauty stood beside cruelty, where even a girl of 17 could be consumed by the machinery of ambition. Jane accepted her new fate with a calm that unsettled her jailers. Chronicler Raphael Holinshed noted how she neither wailed nor raged, but folded her hands and whispered prayers. Yet behind that composure lay the truth that she had been abandoned not only by her council, but by her blood. In an age that prized survival above all else, her innocence and her lineage meant nothing. The Tower closed around her like a tomb. Each passing day deepened her isolation. She had entered the fortress as queen, surrounded by family, by courtiers, by proclamations of loyalty. Now she sat alone, a prisoner in the very place where her reign had begun. The betrayal of kin and the silence of lords marked not just the cruelty of fate, but the corruption of an age that devoured its own children. Within the Tower of London, Jane Grey passed her days not in chains of iron, but in the quiet confinement of her chamber. Light fell across the table where her Bible rested, and she followed the same rhythm with unwavering devotion. At dawn, she prayed. In the afternoon, she read. In the evening, she wrote small notes in the margins of Scripture. Sir John Bridges, the lieutenant of the Tower, later recalled how calm she appeared, her voice soft and even, her hands steady as she turned each page. To those who saw her, she seemed untouched by fear. Yet within her mind, thoughts ran ceaselessly, weaving questions without answers. She thought of the blood in her veins. If she had not been born of the House of Suffolk, if her mother had not been a granddaughter of Henry VII, she might have been free. Without royal blood, she would not be a symbol, not a rival to any throne. She imagined a life in which she lived as a gentlewoman far from court, surrounded by her books. Her only concern, the turning of pages and the pursuit of wisdom. But the truth pressed down on her. In the world of Tudor England, even that life might not have spared her, for women did not rule their own futures. She wondered then what it would have meant to be a man. With her mind, her command of languages, her knowledge of Scripture, she might have found a place in universities, in courts of law, perhaps even in the council chamber. She could have spoken her thoughts aloud and been heard. She could have worn her intellect as armor rather than a burden. Instead, she was a girl of 17, her brilliance hidden behind the curtain of her sex, her fate decided by fathers and uncles and kings. Her thoughts turned often to Guilford Dudley. They had been bound in marriage only weeks before her accession, the union arranged to cement the ambitions of their families. She had been told of it scarcely days in advance. There had been no courtship, no choice, only the expectation of obedience. In her memory, the wedding passed like a scene viewed through glass, her face pale beneath a bridal veil, Guildford by her side with the same nervous stillness. They were strangers joined together, not by love, but by the heavy hand of politics. Now he too was a prisoner within the tower, held in another chamber. She remembered his face in those hurried moments they had shared, both bewildered, both trapped in the same snare. They had not loved one another, not in the way of songs or poems, yet she felt a quiet sorrow for him. He was as much a pawn as she, as much a victim of the fathers who had played this reckless game. Jane sat by her window and let these memories rise and fade, like images projected in a fleeting play. A crown pressed on her head, the faces of her parents urging her forward, the robes heavy upon her shoulders, the wedding veil lowered over her eyes. Each image ran swiftly into the next, as if her life had been little more than a series of scenes chosen by others, her own voice never the author. Her body weakened with the strain, her face drawn, yet her discipline never faltered. Guards noted her composure, and chaplains who visited her were astonished by the clarity of her arguments. But behind that composure, her spirit felt the slow erosion of knowing that her fate was sealed not by crime or sin, but by the accident of her birth. In the silence of her chamber, she prayed not for a crown, not for deliverance, but for the peace of truth. She had come to understand that her tragedy lay not in death itself, but in the knowledge that she had never been allowed to live by her own choosing. Mary Tudor carried the burden of decision long before the axe was lifted. In the early months of her reign, she hesitated. for she knew her young cousin Jane Grey had never sought the crown. Jane was a victim of ambition, a girl whose learning and piety had been twisted into a cause she did not choose. In moments of reflection, Mary spoke of mercy, and within the tower Jane was treated with an unusual gentleness, allowed light and books, as though compassion might yet triumph. That hope ended on the 25th of January, 1554. Sir Thomas Wyatt raised his banner in Kent, calling men to oppose the Queen's marriage with Philip of Spain. To the crowds, it was spoken as defense of England against foreign rule. Yet within the council chamber, the meaning sharpened. As long as Jane Grey lived in the tower, her very name could serve as a rallying cry. Outwardly, the rebellion declared itself against Spain, but beneath its slogans lingered the specter of another queen, a girl whose bloodline still threatened Mary's fragile crown. Mary's counselors seized upon the moment. They warned her that rebellion was fire, and fire always seeks fuel. Jane's existence was fuel enough. They told her that every cry for liberty might yet turn into a cry for Jane. To spare her was to invite further uprisings. To execute her was to secure the throne. Mercy could not outweigh survival. A sovereign of the 16th century could not permit sentiment to weaken power. The Queen struggled with her conscience, yet the weight of her counsel bore down. Chroniclers later recorded how Mary's hand trembled as she signed the warrant. She lowered her eyes as if in prayer, then placed her mark upon the page. The ink spread like blood across parchment, and with it the life of Lady Jane Grey was sealed. In the tower, the news was delivered. Sir John Bridges, the lieutenant, observed her response and later confessed his astonishment. Jane received the sentence with serenity, asking only for time to prepare her soul. She wrote farewell letters, pressing verses into the margins of her Bible which she sent to her sister Catherine. She prayed aloud, her voice steady, as if already beyond the reach of fear. The 12th of February dawned with a cold mist over London. Guildford Dudley was led first to his death. Jane listened in silence, the muffled roar of the crowd and the strike of the axe drifting into her chamber. She pressed her Bible to her chest and whispered a prayer for the husband she had never chosen, a stranger bound to her by politics and now by fate. Soon the guards summoned her. She stepped onto Tower Green, dressed plainly, her hood drawn low. The scaffold rose before her, stark and waiting. The crowd quieted as she climbed the steps. Chronicler Raphael Holinshed later wrote of her words, how she affirmed her faith and declared herself guilty only of obeying those who pressed the crown upon her. Her final speech was more lesson than plea, filled with scripture, delivered with the clarity of a scholar rather than the desperation of a prisoner. When the blindfold was drawn across her eyes, her composure faltered. She reached into the void, her hands searching for the block, her voice breaking as she whispered that she could not find it. The people stirred in anguish, for in that moment she was no queen, no traitor, but only a frightened girl of 17 lost in darkness. The executioner stepped forward, guiding her hand. She lowered herself, laid her neck upon the wood, and folded her hands in prayer. The axe fell in a single stroke. Silence hung over the Tower Green, heavier than the sound of steel. Sir John Bridges later confessed that he never forgot her final moments. The cry of confusion, the sudden return of calm, the innocence extinguished. For all who stood there, it was clear. A throne had been secured, but at the price of a girl who had never wanted to wear its crown. Her coffin was lowered into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, hidden behind the walls of the tower. No trumpets sounded. No procession marked her passing. Only the scrape of stone, the shifting of earth, and then silence. A silence so complete it felt as if the tower itself was swallowing her whole. She was placed among the others who had died by the same blade, a line of women who had carried the curse of Tudor blood. The city returned to its restless noise, yet beneath the laughter of taverns and the tolling of church bells, her image persisted. Londoners could not forget the girl who walked across the green with a Bible pressed to her chest, who spoke of faith with the voice of a scholar, who reached blindly for the block in the dark. That final moment clung to memory like smoke. It entered dreams. It would not leave. For Queen Mary, the rebellion was crushed, the throne secured, yet the ink of her signature had become a shadow across her reign. Mercy had been buried with Jane. Compassion had been silenced beneath the axe. The Tudor crown had taken another life, and the stain would not wash away. Jane's story spread beyond the walls that confined her. Among the Protestants, she became a figure of purity, a martyr whose words of faith rang louder in death than in life. Among the people, she was remembered not as a usurper, but as a girl betrayed, abandoned, and offered to the blade. In her stillness, they saw a mirror of their own fragility, the proof that innocence meant nothing when thrones were at stake. Yet her memory reached deeper than faith or politics. It became the proof of an age that devoured its children. She was scholar and sacrifice, child and queen, victim and warning. Her life was a lesson written not in books, but in blood upon the stones of the tower. A crown could be placed upon her brow one morning, and by the next week it could be buried with her body. That was the cruelty of Tudor England. That was the echo of power. Even now the grass covers Tower Green, but beneath it the earth remembers. The ground drank her blood and still holds it. The stones keep her final cry, a voice of confusion and prayer carried into the silence. Visitors walk past the plaque that bears her name, and though the ravens circle and the sky shifts above, there is a heaviness that cannot be explained. It is the weight of a presence that never left. Lady Jane Grey did not reign in life, yet she reigns in memory. She is the 9 days queen who became eternal in death. She is the girl who showed that thrones are built not on glory, but on sacrifice. She is the echo that refuses to fade. And so her story closes not in triumph, but in a silence more terrible than sound. A silence that still lingers in the tower, in the city, in the very soil of England. If you wish to hear more voices that history tried to silence, stay with us, subscribe, and we will walk further into the halls where crowns were forged from blood and where the innocent were left to haunt eternity.